afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our session today. We're going to give the system a few minutes for everybody to get logged in, and then I'll start with our introductions. All right, it looks like people are showing up within the system, so we'll get started here. My name is Vicki Lightbound. I am the Director for the Water Innovation Program at Alberta Innovates. This is the first webinar in the 2023 Water Innovation Webinar Series. I'd like to take a moment today to respectfully acknowledge that we are coming to you virtually from Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory and Métis Regions 3 and 4 in Alberta. I will highlight that the reach of this work and its activities are influenced by all treaty territory and all Métis regions in Alberta, not just those from which we come to today. This acknowledgement respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. For those of you not familiar, Alberta Innovates is a provincial corporation created to support research and innovation activities. We provide funding programs, advice, connections, technical expertise, and applied research services. Our scope encompasses the whole innovation journey from applied R&D through to commercialization and end use. This includes science informing policy and practices. The Water Innovation webinars share ideas and outcomes from projects funded through Alberta Innovates' Water Innovation Program and highlight other important water initiatives within the province. I hope this session will provide you with some valuable information and spark discussion. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A box. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can after we hear from all of our speakers. The session chat box is a useful tool to connect with the other participants. I would encourage you to use the tool to discuss the session topic, but please don't let it distract you from the presentations. With that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Alberta Innovates Water Innovation webinar. Today's topic is leveraging the experience of nature to address water challenges. Nature is gifted with a large toolbox and has a long history of effective water management worldwide, yet we continue to not take full advantage of these tools and breadth of expertise. Speakers will share insights on the value of nature-based solutions and through case studies comment on the learning, success, and impact of leveraging nature to address water challenges. Today, you will hear from Vic Adamowicz, Professor and Vice Dean, University of Alberta, Danah, Executive Director, Miistakis Institute, Alvin First Rider, Environmental Technician, Blood Tribe Land Management, and Liese Coulter, Research Fellow, Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. So let's get started. I'll pass it over to Vic.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Vicki, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to lead off the session. Let me share my screen. And hopefully, there we go. So I am going to speak to the experiences of nature and water management challenges in a very broad sense and bring an economic perspective. This may not be the best way to start. It's a bit different from what I often do, but let's try it and let's see how we do. So let me start by just giving you a bit of an outline. I'm going to describe as an economist why I come to this problem and I'm interested in nature and natural systems. And I'm framing the question as why invest in natural systems or in nature as nature-based solutions to water management problems and other problems. And to speak probably more focused on the value of water resources and the value of natural systems. Those sometimes appear in market values, but often in what we call non-market values that aren't easily measured in markets. And to talk about some of the challenges that we face from an economic perspective, give a few case studies, things that I've been involved in and things that others I know have worked on, and then wrap things up. So as a very broad thing, when I hear people describe economists, these are the words that pop up. I like this little word chart because I think it's a common way to think about economics and what economists do. For my entire career, I've not done many of those things because I've focused on the environment. And I think that's a piece missing within our standard conception of what economics does. And that's part of the message that I would like to bring, is that nature is important for the economy and is an important part of economics. And a bit of an aside, but if you're interested in a very big picture view on this, just about 2 weeks ago, there was a nice video in the New York Times. Alexander Skarsgård, the filmmaker and actor, put this together. about a person named Partha Dasgupta. Partha was Sir Partha Dasgupta, is the author of The Economics of Biodiversity. You didn't see biodiversity in that set of words before. You didn't see nature. And I think this is part of the link, is to find the connection between our natural systems and our human systems, of which nature is a part. Yeah, let me just finish up on this. I think this is at a very broad global level, the notion of investing in nature and thinking about natural systems from an economics perspective. It's not the only perspective, obviously, but for me, it's what I'm interested in. And I think it brings a dimension of thinking about natural systems. Why invest in nature? Nature's an asset. And again, maybe that's not the right phrase, but it's an important part of our capital stock, of the things that help us enjoy all the goods and services and experiences. And this is from the IISD in Manitoba. And they've done some very interesting work on just measuring natural capital, comparing it to other forms of capital. And I think, again, that's a way for us to think about nature as an asset. This table of numbers, I'm not too interested in the specific numbers, but I think one thing that shows up is those non-market natural capital systems are things we often don't know enough about. And I think colleagues in the seminar are going to provide us some information about those systems. And in general, that's an area that many of us are working on. What really is the value of those natural systems? The US has jumped on board very recently. This is just last year. They are now investing heavily in a natural assets balance sheet. So again, these are the sort of economic terms, balance sheet, but thinking about it in the context of nature, worrying about depreciation of natural assets, as well as investing in appreciation of natural assets. So narrowing it down a bit more, thinking about what nature provides and natural systems and has provided benefits like drinking water and clean drinking water through water quality, through fishing, water-based recreation, flood risk. I'll touch on a couple of these in the case studies. But when we think about natural systems and what they have provided, and the worry that if they're depreciating, they won't be able to provide, I think that brings it into the domain of economics, that we'll lose the benefits associated with those services. And I'll touch on a few of these and end up with the climate regulation component. Not so much directly a water management issue, but how aquatic systems can contribute to climate regulation. Why invest in nature again? Well, the benefits will exceed the costs, very standard in some cases. And in some cases, the natural systems or working with nature may be better than engineered systems. And I'll touch on a couple of these in the case studies. Those benefits and costs, I'm interested in measurement, so we can assess which ones are really worthwhile working on, which ones are better than engineered systems. But it's challenging, and that's why I've got my little magnifying glass there. Sometimes we have to do some detective work to think about what those values actually are and where we should be investing.
Working with beavers, it's a project that began back in 2012. It began with our work with cows and fish. And so working with beavers, we have this core team of the Miistakis Institute and Cows and Fish, which is also known as the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. And we have local partners as well, which includes the Bread Tribe Land Management. We'll be hearing from Alvin today, and the Piikani Nation Lands Department as well. So when our work began, it was specific to a beaver reintroduction project back in 2012 on the Ann and Sandy Cross Conservation Area. And from that work, we quickly learned of local landowners' desires to really look at coexistence solutions for beavers, to really address some of the challenges that people were finding coexisting with beavers, but also to explore how beavers could be used as a nature-based solution. And so our project today, working with beavers, is this collaborative partnership project. And we've been really fortunate to have many funding partners over the last decade. And I think it's really important that, to state that many of them recognizing the need for this multi-year funding that is needed to realize these environmental outcomes that we're looking for. So I'd just like to thank and acknowledge these funders that include our current and some of our past funders. So I would like to offer that beavers are the ultimate nature-based solution. Beavers mitigate the impact of floods and droughts, which they do by storing and delivering water. Beaver dams act as speed bumps They slow water down, allowing it to really to seep into the ground during times of high and normal water levels, but then later releasing cool water during the hot, dry times in later summer, as well as into the frozen times of the year. And during wildfire, beaver ponds can act as fire breaks and a refuge for wildlife and livestock, and also aid in post-fire recovery and restoration and experience less burning. Beaver dams also increase the width of floodplains, reducing erosive forces, increasing the sediment deposition, and improving both water quality and stream complexity. So the combination of beaver dams slowing water and increasing stream complexity results in dampening flood effects on downstream communities. So beavers act as natural flood and drought mitigation tools, which have largely been lost on some of our landscapes due to landscape change and beaver removal. Even when beaver dams failed during the extreme 2013 Alberta floods, they still held back water as the storm progressed. So beavers are a nature-based solution to climate change and adaptation, increasing watershed restoration and resiliency while providing some of these additional ecosystem services that Vic mentioned as well. And recognition of beavers as an effective nature-based solution is really demonstrated in some of the recent media attention that beavers have been afforded as well. And that's also been reflected in research focus as well, that there's a lot of research currently and recently being done on looking at beavers, and some of that research being done right here in Alberta. Dr. Glynis Hood and Dr. Sherry Westbrook in Saskatchewan, they've been really leaders in Canada in demonstrating the role of beavers in our systems and as nature-based solutions for many years. So working with beavers, our goal is to really foster coexistence with beavers so that we can realize these ecological and watershed benefits that beavers afford on the landscape. And we do this through a number of different approaches. One is increasing knowledge, awareness, and participation in activities that restore and sustain these watershed functions. We also provide a lot of training for implementation of coexistence tools so we can keep beavers on the landscape. And we focus a lot of our work on researching new tools and beneficial practices to coexisting with beavers. So this is an example of that some of the work that we've been doing, that while beavers and the wetlands that their dams create play an important role in our ecosystems, beaver dams can create considerable damage to human infrastructure. And that's why, there's been a lot of beaver removal on the landscape. They take down prized trees, they impound waters that flood agricultural lands, and they cause a lot of damage to infrastructure. So to reduce this damage, municipalities and land managers typically manage beavers through just traditional means of removing. But these management approaches, they're costly, and they often do not permanently solve the solutions. As dams are quickly rebuilt, beavers are busy and they can recolonize quickly, and by continually removing them, we're not keeping beavers and realizing the benefits that they give us on the landscape. So this is just an example. This is work that we've done looking at cost benefit analysis of different coexistence tools, because there are tools that allow us to coexist with beavers to minimize this damage that they're causing, primarily through flooding. These are largely through pond levelers or culvert protectors. They're water control devices that are designed to just prevent problems associated with the beaver damming. So largely they prevent the flooding. And these are really efficient, they're cost effective to managing this type of beaver conflict. And so some of the work that we've done is we've compiled research from a number of different sources to present this information to be of use to municipalities so they can start to see how cost effective these coexistence devices can be. this information actually just talks a bit about the devices themselves, but shows that there are cost savings of up to 90%, between 62 and 92%, compared to the normal management. And this doesn't include some of those, economics that Vic was mentioning in terms of then the ecosystem services and benefits that are afforded by keeping beavers on the landscape. This is purely the cost effectiveness of the management regime. So our collaborative, we also try to create a lot of awareness materials. And so we create a lot of videos of when we're installing different devices so that we can share this, so that more and more people become aware of this. These are some of our videos that we host up on our website. We've had over 37,000 views of these different videos. They're very well received. They're hosting on our Working with Beavers website. This is just an example of other tools that we've created. This is an online tool that you can interact with. Again, it's a cost calculator that just gives a rough estimate of when you might see a return on investment of installing a pond leveler. And so you can just think about how much time you're already putting into managing the damage that's caused by beavers, and this will tell you how long it will take you to realize that return on investment. And for this very conservative example of putting in a pond leveler, you would see a return on investment of just over a month of having to continually maintain the damage caused by flooding by putting in a pond leveler. We've recently launched our newest education and awareness and engagement initiative. This is a citizen science program called Beavers from Space. There's a QR code here. If you scan that, that would take you directly to the Citizen Science Initiative. The purpose of this is that we wanted to collect information on beavers, and we also wanted to engage people in the importance of beavers and also the cultural importance of beavers from the Blackfoot perspective, which is included in this Citizen Science Initiative. And so those two objectives marry very well to a Citizen Science Initiative. And so by searching through satellite imagery for beaver dams and lodges in the waterways of the Kainai Nation in southern Alberta, this Citizen Science Initiative, it really is trying to determine where beavers are present on the landscape and where they're not. And so volunteers, they search through imagery of over 7,000 kilometers of streams. And they, through the imagery, can tell us where they see dams and lodges. And with this information, we'll combine that with some field data as well. This will help inform us where best to focus restoration activities through potential installation of beaver dam analogs, which Alvin's gonna speak to a bit later. This initiative, it's hosted on Zooniverse, which is a global citizen science platform. And this is just what the interface looks like. This was just launched last week. We already have had over 1,000 users with over 4,800 classifications of beaver dams and lodges. So we would really look forward to getting results from this, both from a data perspective and from an engagement perspective as well. And a lot of our work is about training. So we host a lot of training sessions through a train the trainer type of model, where we work with municipalities and landowners to help identify what is the best coexistence device to be using to keep beavers on the landscape and minimize damage. And then we train people in the equipment needed, how to install, trying to get this information out as broadly as possible. And our work is also really focused on creating resources to support coexistence and enhance knowledge on beavers. And just some of this past work has included a lit review on the challenges of using beaver coexistence tools in Alberta, that because using beavers as a nature-based tool in Alberta is relatively new, policies and guidelines don't always align. So this is just to help address some of those challenges. We've also conducted a social science survey, which really helped inform our work. It really clearly demonstrated for us Albertans' desires to coexist with beavers. And currently, we're working on the creation of beneficial management practices and a decision support tool that goes along with that, that will really help inform land managers and municipalities and those looking to address beaver issues on what are both the proactive and reactive management approaches, what coexistence tools should be considered, and then the best management practices that will go along with that to provide information on on each of the tools. So this is something that's currently in progress right now, and we will be engaging with different users over the next coming year. We're also undertaking modeling using, it's called a GIS model called BRAT, which is a beaver restoration assessment tool that just uses vegetation, hydrology, and elevation to tell us the maximum number of beaver dams a river system can support. We have run this model to cover the focal area of the Kainai Nation to again help us inform us on where best to focus restoration activities. And this is a model that we can expand out to different areas across Alberta to just really help inform where we could be focusing restoration efforts within our watersheds to enhance coexistence with beavers. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alvin, first writer. Alvin's just going to talk about beaver dam analogs, which would be one of the restoration techniques we would use that the BRAT model could inform. Oh, I don't think we can hear you, Alvin.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I have to double tap it for it to work. But yeah. So yeah, we're partnering with the Miistakis Institute to look at beaver mimicry. Our sister tribe down in Miistakis or the Blackfeet Nation in Montana have incorporated beaver mimicry on the Blackfeet Reservation. And that sparked our interest back in 2019 to try to start implementing these strategies up here just due to climate change and the drought we've been having. Also, the beaver dam analogs, they use a lot of natural materials such as willows to help weave the beaver dam, and that is something that we culturally use. So beavers are looked at as spiritual significance, and being able to help restore their habitat is something that's helpful to the Blackfoot culture and helps kind of rekindle that kinship relationship that has been dormant due to colonization. So last year we installed 3 on the Bud Reserve, similar to the pictures down there, with a handful of different volunteers and partners. So Cows and Fish, the Miistakis Institute, and then the Danah High School come out and helped us, and a few of our technicians. So we just collected materials from around the reserve. The only thing that was kind of brought in was the poles there, and we tackled it for 3 days. We installed 3 of them, at different heights, at different lengths of the stream that are. We utilize some surveying techniques and also riparian health techniques to help determine the actual locations that we install these BDAs. So we're looking at installing more this year, and then incorporating pond levelers with a couple other partners. We have some projects on the go, and we're just trying to help restore that groundwater and help water storage and climate mitigation on the reserve. And then rekindle that relationship with Miistakis or beavers. They have gifted us spiritual artifacts, and like with our Ini rematriation, they also need our help, beavers on the landscape, just because of encroachment of humans into their world, and we need to find out ways that we can coexist instead of being destructive. Utilize ways that help us both coexist in this world. It's beneficial to society, and it's beneficial to the natural ecosystem. I just went out to the Beaver Dam analog site, and there's runoff happening right now, and they've actually withstood the impact of runoff. Come early June in our monsoon rainy season, will be different type of flow intensities, but for now they've withstood the natural channel there, and we're looking at implementing more throughout our reserve. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvin. Yeah, so like Alvin said, we're continuing to with our work with working with beavers, we'll be looking at additional BDA installations in different locations across the province, including on the Blood Reserve, and continued installation of coexistence devices. We'll be integrating a whole suite of monitoring at these beaver dam analogs, so we can get a real sense of impact of the beaver dam analogs from a vegetation, water storage, surface water, and groundwater perspective. And we will be moving forward this year with engagement on those best management practices as well, and our ongoing continued engagement and outreach with beavers. So with that, I'll just say thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much, Danah and Alvin. I really appreciate your presentation and sharing the work that you found and the work you're doing. Highlights the importance of coexistence with nature and the value it can provide to us. So on to our final speaker. I will pass it over to Liese as she's sharing her screen. Just a reminder, you can submit questions for our speakers in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the session.
I am getting the right window here. Maybe when I do this. Yeah, we almost had it a minute ago. There we go. I've got it. Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you today about professional practice in terms of natural infrastructure. So with the International Institute of Sustainable Development and MNAI, which is the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, we've been looking at influences in the prairie provinces, so Alberta, but also looking at things that are happening in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So natural infrastructure, as you're aware, is emerging as a cost-effective solution for water needs in the watersheds across the prairies and across Canada. So there's a new program, Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions, and it aims to scale the infrastructure throughout the prairies to meet these needs and to strengthen regional resilience. So Natural Assets Initiative, we're actually dropping the M sometime in the next few weeks. So you're in the know, will become the Natural Assets Initiative. We provide scientific, economic, and municipal expertise. We support and guide local governments to identify, value, and account for natural assets, which are not that easily reflected in financial planning and asset management programs because nature has been normally considered to be an externality. And we also develop leading edge sustainable and climate resilient infrastructure or assist people in doing that. Now in the prairies, we've had projects that included developing inventories of natural assets for the city of Selkirk, for Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and in the town of Okotoks, we've also completed a management program. So when we look at this overall program looking at natural infrastructure for water solutions, there's a number of priority areas. So strengthening the business case, as Vic was telling us, is a very important aspect, and that goes in hand with mobilizing capital. Strengthening policy, of course, is something that's an issue across the country at all levels. But today I'm going to focus in on supporting municipal adoption. So helping municipalities access the guidance and support they need, and increasing capacity in the rural and underserved communities. And really, I'm going to focus a bit on the people rather than on the natural infrastructure itself. It's also complex, the situations that we're facing between climate change, economic change, environmental change. So there's cross-cutting issues to consider. I'm focusing here today, as I'm saying, on capacity, the people who work in infrastructure as much as the infrastructure that supports people. But at the same time, there are inequities built into the system we have, and if we ignore those, then we risk building them deeper into the systems as they emerge and lose those opportunities to increase equity as we go along. And the other aspect is this watershed level. We've been talking about rainfall and runoff, but of course it doesn't respect political boundaries. And to manage natural assets in a really effective way, we need to look at a watershed and work across watersheds. But I'll focus on people today. So if we take that capacity issue and the municipal adoption issue, then what we're trying to do is develop a roadmap forward. And we figure it happens in 3 steps. We need to start, we need to lever, we need to partner. So advancing professional practice starts by developing some kind of a competency framework for what is it to do NI. And that can be leveraged to guide professional practice and support the partnerships that are going to be needed in so many different ways in so many different places to address the coming issues. So across the prairies, natural infrastructure is nascent. It's beginning, but it's growing momentum, although gray infrastructure still dominates that infrastructure dollar spending. It's increasing to meet water-related infrastructure needs, but the projects are a bit of a patchwork that are happening in different places, and so it hasn't really come up in any kind of consistent way. We're also facing this ongoing loss of critical natural assets, and the functions that that have in the past been served without us noticing it. And only as we lose them do we really understand what those issues are. And as Vic showed, the cost of restoring a natural infrastructure is much, much higher than the cost of keeping what you have. So local capacity is very much a driver in terms of where NI is implemented and how it's done. So showing a clear need to invest in people, organizations, and that pipeline of projects that are going to need to happen that takes so very long from conceptualization to implementation and the very important evaluation that feeds into the next lot. So let's take a look at Alberta. So we've got some prairie challenges up there at the top. They'll be familiar to everyone, I'm sure. In Alberta, cities are really leading the development of natural infrastructure. It's mainly prioritized for stormwater management because of problems with flooding and ecological protection with the history of trying to avoid harm from human activities. And urban forestry, I think, is one of the areas where it's really obvious and visible. When you see a tree, you think nature. And so this is one of the places where natural infrastructure is already making inroads. There are some actions from the provincial government and professional associations that have begun to link those environmental management aims, the regulations and training needed, and then that delivery of ecosystem services that will benefit communities and citizens. In Alberta, the Land Use Planning Hub includes some natural infrastructure resources if you're looking for some sources. And I've got just a little overview of 3 projects in Alberta where natural infrastructure is already being supported. So in Edmonton, they're promoting rain gardens. The Nature Conservancy's protected over 35,000 hectares in the Waterford Reservoir watershed. And cows and fish have been going on for over 30 years in taking care of riparian area restoration, especially to promote fishing. In Saskatchewan, there's not a lot of provincial policy to support or direct natural infrastructure, and that's a significant barrier. But individual leaders, again, are the important drivers. So the city of Saskatoon's a leader. They've done a lot of work in-house. Unfortunately, the province doesn't have a strong policy drive, and so that's a barrier. And the Water Security Agency in Saskatchewan actually controls the majority of the government's core water management responsibilities. And so their attitude and actions really are very much going to be barriers and drivers. So with the city of Saskatoon supporting green roofs, the village of Avonlea has got floating wetlands that are improving water quality, and the Dry Lake Drainage Project has contributed 55 acres of wetland being restored. And that's actually in combination with agricultural producers to support wetland habitat conservation. And that's one of the important partnerships going along between agriculture and nature conservancy. In Manitoba, they do have provincial policies and practices that support natural infrastructure, with multiple cities implementing projects. Their Asset Management Association actually directs members to resources through the MNAI and also to funding sources. Over 65% of Manitoba's Crown land. And so that's managed by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, which is actively inviting innovative land practices, and that's beneficial. There's also a collaborative leadership initiative near Winnipeg that has inventoried the natural resources and natural infrastructure, including the entire Treaty 1 territory. So that's been a very proactive initiative. So sample projects, Ducks Unlimited, of course, has been working across the prairies for a long time, and they've conserved nearly 4,400 acres of private wetlands and grasslands. The village of Danah is using floating vegetation to treat their secondary wastewater. And the city of Winnipeg's reducing stormwater runoff with naturalized stormwater ponds, which they've actually made a requirement, which is a very useful policy option. So there's an overview of the prairies. So when we look at the practice of doing natural infrastructure, which I've coined the NIP network, in the prairies, there's a question of who. So it's accomplished by a wide range of private consultancies and practices and by municipal staff. The opportunities to improve this actually are very much focused on the professional associations that could actually help their members to change professional norms to better incorporate natural infrastructure. The barriers, of course, is that it's not a focus in professional development currently. It's not an educational norm to include nature in terms of civil engineering, for instance. And there's a real disconnection between perceptions of what's the demand for natural infrastructure and what's the capacity available. So that local governments might think they can't get the consultancy services they need, and consultants are slow to upskill and invest in that if they don't think there's a demand. So these things all fit together. So we've been taking a look at what is this network in the prairies. And my little horrendogram there on the left. This is really focused on Alberta, but we've got a number of different actors, and we've tried to figure out by interviewing people who work in natural infrastructure projects. So who do you work with? Who do you talk to? Who do you have to pay attention to? And what we came up with was that there's consultants, businesses, professions, clients. There's municipalities, there's staff and council. There's the watersheds, the governments, and the individual settlements that will have a level of influence. And then there's also these broader, deeper influences in NGOs, civil society, and universities. So taking all that and trying to look at it in a slightly more organized way, we came up with a simple set of groupings. So expertise in local government seemed to be the most influential. And there's a broad influence from larger governments, watersheds, and settlements, and then a more secondary influence from universities, NGOs, and civil society. So in terms of expertise, their influence is in meeting municipal needs. If we're looking at local government, they're creating a demand for services in the local landscape. If we're looking at that broad influence, it's really the top-down policies and programs, and the secondary are more indirect, advocating and informing for natural infrastructure and practice. So if we take a look at specific professions, one of the engineers in Alberta said that within civil engineering, there's a role of the accreditation board and regulators to require more content on things like the climate risk adjusted hydrologic modeling. Increasing that within the civil engineering curricula would be an interesting entry point. So it's been useful speaking directly with the people involved to understand the specifics of where interventions could be useful. So engineers are influential. They have an immediate influence on NI, partly because of the legal significance of their professional advice. They have to sign off on some things, and there are regulations in terms of who can and cannot actually okay certain kinds of projects. They can be traditional, and they rely on traditional engineering approaches for confidence and credibility, and many of them are less familiar with the merits of NI. And interestingly, their voice is well respected. So if they say that you shouldn't go for natural infrastructure, even though they don't know a lot about it, they have a lot of influence. And they develop professionally throughout their career. So multiple interventions might be needed across the whole learning ecosystem if you want to shift professional norms to include NI more. Planners are another influential profession. And one of the planners in Manitoba said that they work with engineers closely, not just on the standards, but also looking to see how to incorporate NI and merge it with the grey infrastructure. So natural infrastructure isn't in isolation. It has to connect with all the other kinds of infrastructure that we use. And finding ways to do that is part of the partnerships that are needed. So planners are influential, and the Canadian Institute of Planners is the umbrella organization across the country. So they form a national network that link climate change adaptation often with natural infrastructure and natural asset management. Now, planners have to navigate the regulations. In very small areas, the planning function is often one simply of seeing if the rules are being met, and they don't get to do new planning. But the municipal government acts really guide what they're going to be doing. And so if those things are modified to include more direction, then planners have the opportunity to help implement that. And planners develop professionally as well, of course. So their planning associations will play a big role in moving forward and developing training requirements and professional direction. So now if we take a look at those influences, we can see that expertise and local government make a big difference in terms of how these projects get to be delivered. So this brings us to the learning and the learning ecosystem. So the idea of a natural infrastructure learning ecosystem really pays attention to the fact that we learn throughout our lives, throughout our careers, and the assumptions, the professional norms that we learned early on are not necessarily the ones that we want to perpetuate. So it's more than education. It's about professional education and a lot of interdependencies between developing knowledge and synthesizing what you know. And professions keep developing. So outside of that educational institution, we'll need to have other kinds of professional practice and problem solving that teach us new skills. And a learning ecosystem is complex. So if we're going to try to address the design, development, and maintenance of natural infrastructure, there are multiple entry points where we might actually try to intervene. So we come up with this schematic of what a natural infrastructure learning ecosystem might involve. So we've got the formal education that comes from universities and colleges, Indigenous and local knowledge that help us to understand what works here and now and in the past. Those work experience, practice, the rules of thumb that we tend to follow. Leadership experience, informal education, rather like what you're here today listening to. And those associations, conferences, professional development that can be moderated. And once again, expertise, professionals, and local government, these are the key players who need to both contribute to and then take from this learning ecosystem. And to do that and to focus, here you see the center is not engineers, planners. When I was first given this, and I realized that we needed to have natural infrastructure in the middle, because the way that it's going to be interpreted is going to happen with different competencies depending on different professions. But in all cases, they really need to have that idea of natural infrastructure as the heart and the core. So to move forward with this, what we need is to develop a framework of competencies that need to be applied across multiple professions and can allow people to actually increase our capacity to do this work. So this roadmap going forward, work with nature. It develops multiple benefits rather than just avoiding harm. Advance the competencies, increase the knowledge, skills, and abilities that new staff bring, and also build capacity for those people who are currently working and need to develop new perspectives on natural infrastructure to bring that into their work roles. So start, leverage, and partner. We can start by developing this competency framework over the next 1 to 3 years. Leverage that framework to guide a program of educational initiatives over the next 4 to 7 years. And then nurture ongoing those partnerships that are needed to bring this in across the board. So start, leverage, and partner. So advancing professional practice begins with a competency framework for professional development, and that can leverage professional practice and support partnerships. It's about finding entry points and working with existing champions in professions. And already groups are doing good work to better embed NI in professional practice. So MNAI hosts natural infrastructure resources on their website, and have recently put out a legal primer that's quite valuable, and also a guide to developing levels of service for natural assets. And the IISD new State of Play report is going to be looking at NI on the prairies, and that'll be published next month. So stay tuned to learn more, find practical support, and develop those partnerships. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll move into our Q&A session now. So I'll get all of our speakers to turn their cameras back on. We have a few questions from the attendees, and you're welcome to continue to submit your questions through the Q&A box as we move through the next half hour. We'll answer as many as we can. So starting with the first question here from Tammy Rosner. I have seen in many cases where project engineers are shutting down ideas that could be helpful but are not part of their project scope mandate. What is the process to get these ideas to the right people without compromising the project engineer's very valid priorities of scope, schedule, budget, value, and safety? So that's to everybody if anybody wants to take that first.
I guess I'll start because, you know, we hate a vacuum. This partnership idea is one of the important ones, and finding your champions. So one of the things that we found in some places that you can get something called a stranded champion, where you're, you know, very strong on what you need, but you need to bring others along. So learning how to influence, it might need to be incremental, but can you find somebody who's already interested or somebody who's doing something and then help them, and possibly then they can help you rather than start something completely out of the blue.
And recognizing that.
I guess I would chime in with just the part of it's back to the formal education and just expanding that diversity of opportunities and scope, and making sure that in the process of considering options that scope is wide. I think a lot of it is just getting the evidence out there that there are new ideas, maybe old ideas that we're going to reconsider that would, through evidence, show that they're valuable.
And I think we should emphasize what we've heard a little bit today in terms of making it known the value of natural assets, whether it's from a cultural perspective, as we heard from Alvin, or from an economic perspective, or from a water perspective, I think there's inherent value that isn't well quantified right now, and we maybe need to quantify so that it does fall into that scope, schedule, budget, value, safety that are the core considerations for many traditional projects. All right, so move on to another question here. This question, and I'm going to apologize for my pronunciation, is from Shmuel Yerushalmi. He is wondering about how investment in water and natural-based solutions can support water security and resolving problems related to water shortages in countries with desert or arid climates, as an example, southern Alberta. Maybe I'll get you, Danah, to start beaver solutions and flood and drought support.
Sure. I think if I'm interpreting the question properly, well, I think similar to some of the information that Vic shared, like investment, I think we've demonstrated how there's return on investment, but then also how there's cost savings in investing in nature-based solutions. And I think, but also kind of what Vic just said a minute ago as well, I think the more and more we can demonstrate the effectiveness of these types of solutions, I think we need to be, being able to show that and quantify that more about how some of these natural solutions or, gray infrastructure or green infrastructure compared to gray infrastructure, how these can have cost savings, but also not strictly from the economics, but then can have real measurable impacts from a water quality, so that you're having to invest less in water treatment facilities or thinking about, when there is less access to water in terms of water storage. So I think the more and more we can demonstrate nature-based solutions, there'll be more willingness to invest in them.
And Vicky, and if I can just jump in, I haven't worked in countries with desert or arid environments for a long time, but I do have a couple of colleagues who work in that area. And Shmuel, if you'd like to send me an email, I can direct you. And Mark Juland and Dale Whittington work extensively in countries in Africa, for example, on water management systems. And some of it is linked to understanding nature and increasingly interest in solar and solar powered systems as alternative energy sources to support irrigation and drinking water and such. Some of it's also working with appropriate equitable pricing strategies and investing back in some of the natural and human constructed infrastructure. So complex question, and I'll deflect, but welcome to send me a note, and I'll point you to my colleagues who I know work in those regions.
And I'll just add something on that one as well. I spent many years in Australia, and so this huge issue of too much water and too little water, whether you have a monsoon system, whether you have a desert system. There are vegetation types. They do these thing called xeriscape gardening, where you have really low water requirements. And this is one of the things that's going to be happening as we have something called desertification. So we've got areas that didn't used to be desert that will become desert, and we have other areas that were quite arid that will change. So native vegetation isn't necessarily going to be your friend. That is native vegetation from the past. What you might want to do is start looking at what your native vegetation of the future will be. And so it may be that what we'll do is we'll use local solutions and indigenous solutions that were used in other areas and take those lessons and apply them to new areas. And so I think there's a temptation to try to build a big bathtub, hold all the water, and then let it out when there's time. But that's looking at what nature-based solutions have been historically used in desert areas are really going to help to feed you as we move into the future.
Our next question here is from Veronica Swiston. This is for Danah. Has the population of beavers on farmlands increased in the last 40 years? And if so, what would be the reason for this?
Yeah, and I'll maybe ask Alvin to weigh in on this too about what he sees out on the land as well. I mean, I guess my response to that is we don't have a good assessment of beaver populations in the province. There's that's not quantified, but I think there is, we know from our work with landowners that there is a lot of recognition of people are starting to see the benefits of coexisting with beavers, especially in areas in the south that are more dry, that ranchers have seen that when they coexist with beavers on the landscape, they start to retain the water and they're able to water their livestock. And so I think there are areas where there's more recognition. Having said that, there are municipalities, I think, that still, there have been, in the past bounties on beavers, but beavers are still removed from the landscape quite a bit. But I think, and again, this comes back to the more and more we can demonstrate those environmental benefits. But I don't know if Alvin has anything to add about just what you've seen in terms of if there's more or less beavers on the landscape. Do you have anything to add, Alvin?
It just might be the volume has to go up, Alvin.
Yeah, looks like you come off mute. No, try again now. No, sorry. Okay. Yeah, thanks for trying.
Yeah, and I just see as a follow-up to that, someone said, like, on the question there, the beavers are on the pest list. Yes, that beavers are managed as a fur bearer in the Wildlife Act. That's how they're currently managed in the project in the province.
All right, so we'll move on to the next question there, and we can go back to Alvin if he can get his sound on. We have a question here for Vic. You presented data from a cost-benefit analysis looking at wetland restoration approaches and avoidances along with their GHG emissions profile. This informed on climate change mitigation potential. I haven't come across many nature-based solution studies which have simultaneously combined CBAs or cost-benefit analysis for both mitigation and adaptation. Is this because it's difficult to do, or have the studies simply often been of narrower focus?
Well, thanks, Brett. That's a great question. The simple answer is yes, it's difficult to do, and often the studies are narrow. But I think there are a few studies out there that try to capture multiple benefit streams, often in the context of stacking benefits. So if your target benefit is carbon sequestration, and then other benefits come along with it in the co-benefit category. I would love to do an overlay of something like that US study on the flood risk reduction benefits and overlay that with the carbon sequestration elements. They may be highly correlated, that a particular location is beneficial in both. They might not be. I think we learn a lot from doing studies like that. Technology's there. I think it's something that we should be investing more in doing. In the Council of Canadian Academies panel, the co-benefits piece came up very often, and very often the concern was we just don't have enough information at local levels to really quantify some of these. But that would be a fantastic next step. Yeah, great question.
I might add to that in that adaptation came late to the party. So people were looking at carbon sequestration for a lot longer than they've been considering adaptation issues. And also the adaptation, it depends on what level of warming you're expecting, whereas sequestration just depends on carbon. So the fundamental problem definition is so different that we think of them, because it's a climate change thing, as being quite similar. But in fact, carbon sequestration and adaptation have got almost nothing to do with one another. And the fact that we have to make huge changes in our whole society to deal with a low carbon economy with climate impacts really means that you're putting together two things that are otherwise quite disconnected. So it's taking us a while to get our head wrapped around the two. and put them together.
Thank you. We are going to go back to beavers here, it looks like. So question from Greg. Where are we with respect to getting permits for the relocation of beavers?
I don't know if I have much of an update. I think they're.
Your sound isn't working here for a second. We'll try it again. Might take a minute for the mute to work.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it's my understanding that permits are kind of reviewed on a case-by-case basis. That it's governed under the Wildlife Act, and so it's not something that I think there's like a clear governing regulation on relocation overall. And I think it's just on a one-by-one basis that they provide. I know like they have given some approvals in the past, but I think it's reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. I had a question here for Liese, but I think we've temporarily lost her. So I will move on to another question. We have a question here from Georgina Palmer. It's more general questions, so we'll get some overall thoughts. A recent research paper from University of Birmingham created a smart methodology for early flood monitoring through collaboration between communities and policymakers, with the aim of exchanging local knowledge to inform better decisions for the best flood mitigation solution for each area. Given the limited resources of governments and growing risk of flooding with climate change, do you anticipate that government bodies may incorporate such collaborative approaches more often in future water management solutions? I don't know if anyone wants to try that one.
I've got a couple of thoughts on that one. I think the things that Danah talked about in terms of citizen science fit in there really nicely. There's just such an increased interest and witnessing the power of citizen science for research, but also to inform policy. And I think folks are listening. On the flood side itself, one of the interesting concepts I've heard recently was to think parallel to the old volunteer fire departments, to have volunteer flood departments. Communities thinking from a community perspective, how do we help if there's a flood? How do we prevent risks? It's another interesting way to get communities involved and link with local government. So I think there's some fun ideas floating around, and it's just sort of pulling them together and popularizing them.
Definitely be able to speak from our perspective as well. At Alberta Innovates, a lot of our projects, more and more, we're seeing that collaborative effort where you're really seeing a not-for-profit or a community working with a government body or some other funder to get a lot of these initiatives going. And government can often sit as an observer or an information taker from these initiatives. So I definitely think that's what we're going to see more and more of. I think we've got Liese back here. So I'll have a question for you. What other registered professions offer value in expertise regarding nature and nature-based solutions aside from engineers and planners? They're surprised agrologists, foresters, or biologists were not mentioned.
Yes, and I had a short presentation, so I didn't want to go into too much detail there. Asset managers are very important. Ecologists, biologists. In fact, as we look at it, we realize that people who deal with local government administration, CFOs, and it turns out accountants and financial planners, all of these people have got a role to play. And in fact, if you focus on the project, it's easy to get stuck into the who builds the thing, who designs the thing. But in fact, the problem definition, the question is, what do we need infrastructure for? That question needs to be informed by people who have some idea that natural infrastructure might help. So I think that's why we really need to get this competency framework going, where it's a competency framework around natural infrastructure. And then it's a bit like adapting to climate change. which profession is not going to have to adapt to climate change? There's nobody who's excluded. We all live in this world. And so in the same way, as natural infrastructure becomes more and more important for a whole variety of reasons, we'll find that there's multiple professions that are going to need to understand this. And ideally, over the next 5 to 10 years, it'll become part of daily life.
I'm just going through a few other questions here that have come in through the chat box here. I have a question as I go through the ones here, but when we talk about nature-based solutions, it's a pretty broad overarching concept. If you go within that, there's preservation of natural systems, there's restoration of natural systems, and there's also mimicry of natural systems. I was wondering if I could get some thoughts on the relative cost and benefit of those various stages. Yeah.
In my head, I kind of think of it as kind of like mitigation hierarchy in a way that preservation is, where we are the gold standard and we want to keep what we have on the landscape, and that should be our priority. But then in places where that's not an opportunity, then of course we should be looking at restoration and mimicry.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable strategy. Again, it depends on the context, but to me, mimicry is us really thinking and being creative and viewing other perspectives in terms of the services that nature can provide, and maybe a very cost-effective approach. And that's beavers, natural disturbance management and forestry, all those types of things have really thought about what can we learn from nature for the kinds of services that we're interested in. And maybe that moves us away from just relying on gray infrastructure and gray solutions to outcomes, which are good in some cases, but maybe not good in the entire case. So bringing it into that portfolio, having people think broadly about options and bringing new options to the table, it's always good to think about. But I do agree with you that the space is kind of confusing with all the different ways to think about nature-based solutions to what is that the retention side? Is it modifications that really enhance nature or invest in nature? Is it avoiding depreciation? So I think there's some scope for some kind of categories or big bins to put things in to help us think about them.
The general question here from Robin related to preserving natural systems. So how can we move forward with family farm partners and municipalities with the idea of not using pesticides and herbicides? Could be a tough question.
There's a whole bunch of management strategies. And so we have many options and opportunities. I think as we move forward, it's going to become part of that cost benefit as well. We're looking at food security issues. We're looking at broad scale farming. We're looking at old scale practices where you can kind of pour some money on it and throw some Roundup at it and set and forget. That's going to not work as well as it used to. So it still has to be managed in a way where pesticides have to be used in ways that are thoughtful and honest. And I think that's actually what we have to do. It's not just make them all go away or just use them, but it's rather like these hybrid solutions. They'll use smart meters on something that's an absolutely pristine ecosystem, but that doesn't mean we're not going to use satellite data that we can send up and bring back or look at our LiDAR, so it has to be this combination of multiple different methods. And so the role of pesticides just has to be reconsidered.
I think we'll wrap up with one last question here. This is from Cassandra in Arizona. Here in Arizona, we are having major issues with mining companies obliterating sacred indigenous lands, permanently altering our our water table in the quest for green resources, and taking advantage of water policy, a form of greenwashing. Have you come across these issues in your region? If so, how have you addressed it? So that's a tough one. I guess it's really looking at being honest with the value of what we're doing and making sure that when we talk about nature-based solutions, that it really is a natural solution. It comes back to the categories we were talking to as well. I think of preservation, restoring, and mimicry.
I think there's an element too of top down and bottom up. So if the top down pretends that's not happening, it will continue to happen. So we need policies and we need enforcement. And as you can see from these little snapshots that gave you across the prairie, the three prairie provinces are actually supposed to be somewhat differently. And if you have a change in government, then you also differently again. So that's one aspect.
I think if I can just throw in a couple of thoughts on this, it is a tough question, and we do worry about issues like greenwashing. I think it comes back to where's the evidence, who's collecting the data, what are the data showing us, and there are a number of different data sources. There's traditional knowledge, there's citizen science, there's the standard approaches for monitoring that many jurisdictions are involved in. I think it's really the richness of looking at that data and trying to assess where are we headed? What are the trajectories? What are the claims? Are they lining up with those trajectories? So I think that data and evidence-based from multiple sources is what would be really interesting to maintain and keep looking at.
Well, thank you, everyone. A big thank you to our speakers, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's session. I hope this discussion sparks some new ideas. The session recording will be available for future viewing. An email will be sent out when it's uploaded, usually within about 24 hours. And watch your emails for future sessions planned for 2023. We look forward to connecting with you all again soon. Thank you.